Welcome back, everybody, to the Coaching Revolution podcast. I have some questions for you. Have you ever had a client that consistently shows up late for sessions? Or maybe a client that always cancels last minute? Or maybe even a client that all of a sudden has a really bad attitude about what you're discussing in session, or maybe even a client that gets upset at you for seemingly no reason. If yes, and you haven't known what to do about scenarios like this, you're in for a treat today. That's because we're diving into okay, I got to start all over again. Take two. Welcome back to the Coaching Revolution podcast. Questions for you today. Have you ever had a client that consistently shows up late for sessions? Or maybe have you had a client that always cancels last minute or often cancels last minute? Or maybe you've even had a client that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, has a really bad attitude about what you're discussing in session. Or maybe a client that gets upset at you out of nowhere. If you've answered yes to any of these questions and you haven't known what to do about it, you're in for a treat today, because we're diving into all of that today as we talk about one of my most favorite topics when it comes to being better able to support our clients to create what they want in their lives. Today's topic is also one that will help you support yourself more towards all of your personal goals. We're going to start to look at what I call client resistance. And this is a topic that is so deep with so many important details and nuances that we could literally spend weeks learning about it and training on it. And in my training programs, we do spend weeks on this topic, learning all of the principles and then the techniques of navigating client resistance and then practicing it. Client resistance is one of the most important modules that we cover in the Sacred Depths Transformational Practitioner Training. Though, truth be told, all of the modules that we cover in Sacred Depths, in my opinion, are very important and very juicy. But the resistance one is important because knowing how to navigate client resistance is a game changer for any coach or therapist or transformational practitioner who's serious about working with humans in all of their human messiness and not running away from it. For our podcast episode today, we're going to cover the first important basics of what client resistance actually is. If you haven't heard me talk or teach about this before, you're going to learn some really important things today. And if you have heard me talk about this before, you're going to pick up some new pieces. And I'll tell you also off the bat, today's podcast exploration is the kickoff for a lot of teaching and training that I'm going to be doing on the topic of navigating client resistance over the next couple of weeks. I'm very excited about all of it, and I'm going to be sharing more on what I'm going to be teaching and training and how you can get involved in all of that. I'll share about that later in this episode. But for now, let's start here. There are lots of different ways to understand and define resistance. For our purpose today, we're using the term resistance in a very, very particular way as follows. It's when you're supporting your client to achieve their goals and an obstacle comes up for your client in such a way that you, as the practitioner, feel that you don't have the green light to continue to work on the obstacle with them. In other words, when the resistance comes up, the obstacle and usually the client seem really elusive, and it feels as if you're not allowed to further explore what's going on. So maybe as you're starting to see, and this is really important, the resistance that we're going to be talking about today is different from obstacles that come up that your client can immediately recognize are symptoms of fear or limited thinking. The resistance that we're talking about today is way sneakier than simple fear or negative thought patterns, which, of course, both of which are neither simple at all. The resistance that we're talking about today is sneaky because the client is unaware that there are deeper things underneath it, and it presents itself as a reasonable reason that clients can't move forward on their goals, on their desired outcomes. And then it comes out as a resistance to the work with you or even to you, the practitioner. I bet you are wanting examples on all of this so that you can have a deeper illustration. And I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. But what I hope you're already starting to see is that when resistance comes up for a client, if you as the practitioner don't know how to respond to it and navigate it, it can do a number on the client container and the work that you're doing together with your client. Resistance that isn't addressed correctly, or resistance that's not addressed at all, because oftentimes when practitioners don't know how to navigate resistance, they just try to ignore it and hope it's going to get better. But resistance that isn't addressed correctly can bring the work that you're doing with a client to a halt. And if you're not well equipped to handle and navigate resistance, I'll tell you, it can become very not fun for you as the coach or the practitioner. And you may even know this from your own experience. And the thing is that most practitioners these days don't know how to handle resistance because they don't really understand resistance. And if you don't understand the client motivation behind resistance, and if you don't know how to masterfully move your clients through it, then you can end up feeling drained, tired, frustrated, questioning yourself and your abilities, thinking too much, overthinking about your client's situation. And then, not to mention, your client can become frustrated or lose some hope in the work with you. So there are nearly endless ways that this kind of resistance can show up. and manifest in a client's behavior towards you or towards the coaching that you're doing together. And I want to share with you some of the most common resistance behaviors. See if you recognize any of these. Clients not showing up on time. And I'm not talking about once a client is late, right? But this is kind of a habit. A client is showing up late consistently. It could be this kind of resistance that we're talking about. Here's another example, a client that cancels last minute. Again, I'm not talking about a one-time thing. There was an emergency and the client needed to cancel. Talk about this happening kind of regularly, that the client is canceling last minute. It may be because resistance is lurking. Or you might have clients that completely ghost you, right? They just don't show up at all. They don't respond to your messages. Something big might be going on in their lives that they've ghosted you. But that being said, it may also be that resistance is showing up. Here are some other examples. Oftentimes, if a client has a bad attitude towards the work that you're doing together, chances are resistance is in there. If a client doesn't do their homework, again, I'm not talking about one busy week, but if it becomes a habit, or if they tend to just not do the homework at the times where it feels really scary to do it, we can call that resistance. Clients that are generally whip smart, but when you talk about something big or challenging, they get stuck in confusion or not understanding, chances are resistance is lurking. If you have a client that generally has it together and is grounded and gets things done, but when they're challenged, they get really, really overwhelmed and all of a sudden can't do anything, it's very likely the resistance that's showing up. If you have a client that says things like, I just can't stop procrastinating, or I don't know why I don't just do the action steps that we strategized on, it might be that resistance is lurking. If you have a client that tends to go a lot into woe is me and I'm so helpless and I can't do it because, right, it might be something else. You want to use all of your listening skills and your coaching skills to see, but it could be that resistance is rearing its head. I'll give you a couple more examples of resistance. If you've got a client that a lot in session, as you suggest certain ideas or strategies, is saying, oh, I already knew that. That's nothing new. Been there, done that. There might be some resistance going on there. If you've got a client that is constantly upset that you're not moving quickly enough, or gets upset at you that you're not doing enough, it might be that resistance is rearing its head. Okay, so those are some examples. There are many, many more, but those are some of the most popular, or the most common ones, I should say, that, I've seen and people have told me about over the years. And here's what I want you to know next. If this has happened to you, a client has brought up any of these things, and it's stopped you in your tracks, or you haven't known what to do about it, my friend, please, please don't beat yourself up. Don't beat yourself up. I want you to know that most practitioners don't know how to navigate client resistance. Most practitioners, before they go through the Sacred Depths transformational practitioner training, don't know what to do about it. That's because navigating client resistance isn't a skill that we're born with innately. You can't know how to navigate resistance unless you've been taught. So if this has happened to you, please be gentle with yourself. It has happened to the best of us. I have been there myself, and you can learn the skills to be able to work with it. And here's the other thing I want to say. Maybe as I was going through that list of common resistances, you also recognize that maybe you've been that client in resistance at some point. If that's you, know that you're in good company. I have been there myself. And I will tell you, before I became aware of resistance and the nature of resistance and how it manifests and how it operates and what it's about and what to do with it, as a client, I was kind of like the queen of resistance when I was working with other practitioners. I mean, looking back now, I can see that at times I was a really, really tough client. And I kind of cringe to think what those practitioners might have thought about me back then. I also think about how I didn't end up receiving all that I could have received from those practitioners because of the deep resistance that I was in. The more that I learned to work with my resistance, then the more I could see it on the spot if I was about to step into it. And the being able to see it on the spot, it allowed me to shift gears into understanding what was really going on for me. For example, I could see that when I had that impulse to cancel last minute for no reason other than I thought I wasn't in the mood or it wouldn't be helpful for me, I was able to see in those moments, oh, this is resistance. There's something going on here that's more than just this excuse of, nah, it's not going to really be helpful, right? Okay, before we go any further with the episode today, I want you to know this. If this topic of resistance is really piquing your interest, and if you are feeling that it's really important for you and for your client work and just for yourself personally, and if you want to spend time learning more on this topic and really getting into the wisdom and the techniques for navigating resistance, there are two opportunities that I'd love to let you know about and invite you to. The first is coming up on May 30th. It's called 6 Steps to Supporting Clients to Navigate Resistance. And on that 90-minute live session, we're going to come together and we're going to cover an understanding of the psychology behind human resistance. We're going to talk about what I call the resistance archetypes. The judge, the victim, the confused one, the know-it-all, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to be teaching a little bit about those resistance archetypes, how to identify which resistance archetype is showing up for your clients or for yourself. We'll talk a little bit about the MO of each of those resistance archetypes. On May 30th, in these 90 minutes, I'm also going to go through an overarching outline of a 6-step somatic technique for navigating client resistance. It's a really, really juicy, content-filled 90 minutes. And those 90 minutes are also an introduction to the work that we do in a longer 4-session navigating client resistance intensive training. And that 4-session intensive training online is going to happen this June. In June, we're going to dive into 4 weeks of the Navigating Client Resistance intensive training. And I'll teach you over those 4 weeks in full with details and scripts and cheat sheets and much more, the full 6-step somatic process for navigating client resistance. I only offer this 4-week training every couple of years and it sells out quick. So I'm excited to let you know about it now. And I'll drop the links to both the May 30th call and the 4-week training into the show notes. And I do highly recommend tuning in at least for the May 30th masterclass. But if you aren't able to, I want to take our learning so far and this exploration today just one step further for now. And here's just a little bit more about what I want you to know about resistance for now. You may have already started to surmise this from how I've been talking about and defining resistance, but I want to be really explicit about it, explain a little bit more. Not always, but very often, resistance is a symptom of or a response to fear. Not always, but often, resistance is either a symptom of fear or a response to fear, and especially a fear that hasn't yet been made aware of or worked through deeply. So another way of saying it is as follows. Resistance is your ego's very smart and tricky way of distracting you from actually working with a core fear. When you work with the core fear, it's going to help you move forward, but it takes bravery. It takes courage. It takes being willing to stretch and to risk to look at a fear. And so sometimes your ego is kind of like, not going to do that. We're going to bring up this resistance of showing up late for a session or getting mad at the practitioner or getting confused or getting overwhelmed, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to focus on that as a distraction so that we don't have to look at the deeper fear. The way I often like to describe it visually is that, you can think of, I usually take my fist and, you can think of the fear as the fist that is it's like an inner core fear. And then imagine taking your other hand and wrapping it around the core fear. That's the resistance. The resistance wraps around the core fear and distracts from the core fear. It hides the core fear so that we don't have to look at it. And that inner core fear might be the fear of being seen, the fear of getting it wrong, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of failing, the fear of rejection, fear of others getting angry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes, again, it hides, right? It protects itself through the resistance. It protects itself through procrastination, right? When you procrastinate, you don't really have to deal with your fear of failing. I mean, you do, right? But some part of you thinks that you don't have to. Or confusion, right? We said getting confused is another form of resistance. Getting confused is a great distraction from taking action so that you don't have to be in the discomfort of the fear of being seen. Getting angry or blaming your coach or practitioner, right? That's the resistance, is a beautiful distraction mechanism from looking at a deeper fear of getting rejected if you move forward with a strategy, etc. So hopefully you can see how resistance is sneaky, because the procrastination, the confusion, the stalling, the blaming, all of those resistance things, all of those excuses totally distract from the fear. So just to be crystal clear again, what we're talking about here is very different than a client saying, I'm scared to do X, or I'm scared to accomplish Y, or I'm scared of what others will think if I Z. When our clients can name that they're scared or quickly be willing to look at the fear, then we as practitioners, we can work with the fear directly. But when a client is in resistance, when they're showing up late, when they're having a lot of issues with the strategies that you co-create together, or any of the things that I've mentioned throughout this episode, then you don't have that green light to work directly with the fear or with the limited thinking that is in the core of the resistance. It's still being hidden or distorted by that very distracting surface resistance. And in those cases, you as a practitioner need a different strategy to be able to start to poke holes in the resistance and co-create awareness with your client so that they can actually, from a much more helpful perspective, see what's going on for them instead of just thinking, oh, I just forgot to show up for the session, or, oh, it's just that my coach is wrong with the strategy, etc., etc. All right. We packed a lot into this short episode. I hope that you enjoyed and really got a lot of value. This is obviously just the first little toe dipping into resistance and how to work with it, what to know about it. As I said earlier, this is a vast and deep and such a powerful, powerful topic. I hope that it gave you a lot to think about today, both in terms of yourself and your own resistances, as well as your client work. And again, I hope that you will join me for either the community masterclass on May 30th or for our formal 4-week training on this later in June. For now, I am wishing you well. I want to remind you to share this episode or this podcast with any friends that you think would love it. And if you loved this episode, please go ahead and give us a 5-star rating and review. As always, I am grateful to you for being an incredible, committed, and ethical practitioner, and for taking the time to be with me today.